our secretary, Landon Clark, and for treasurer to join the executive committee here, Dorothy Owens. So I don't know, I move we just consent agenda this and call it good. Any discussion? There we go. We have a second from Judy. Any discussion, concerns, questions?
Let's correct Dorothy's name.
Thank you, Richard. I wasn't going to be a jerk, but
I'm good at it.
Well, if we're doing that, then there's only one R in my name too. So yeah. We will correct everyone's names. And then, so any opposed?
no. Now let me make one thing clear. In case anybody asks, West Point's official representative to the Salt Lake Community Network is Alan Phelps. And he's been elected by the board, and that will, by doing that, and he's been attending all of your meetings and everything else. So by doing that really frees me up then to take on the treasurer stuff.
Thank goodness.
If anybody has a question about it, and when we get our first $1 million, then I may reconsider the job, but you know, up to now. But just so people understand why there's both of us on the attending the meetings.
No worries. Anyone is welcome, so the entire board can participate. The only thing is, if there were ever actually a vote, which happens very rarely, then technically it is in the bylaws that, first of all, someone who is not necessarily the chair of their board in their own community organization, you don't have to be that chair to participate on the executive committee of the Salt Lake Community Network, frankly, just because we can't align all the elections. If every time someone was moved along in their position in their community organization, we had to change over SLCN, it would get really complicated really quick. So we do have a provision in there to allow for, you know, anyone that's actively engaged in community work can certainly participate. And then if ever it comes down to a vote, then it's simply one vote per community organization. So regardless of how many people you have here, only one vote counts. But hopefully in this case, this should be pretty easy. Any further discussion, questions, concerns? Anyone? Seeing nothing, I'm going to assume all in favor. So any opposed, speak now or forever hold your peace. All righty. We are done. We have had elections. We have our new executive committee. So
is everybody on the same term? Is it a 2-year term or a 1-year term, Dennis?
It's a 2-year term. However, half of us, and I forget which half, are fulfilling their existing 2-year term that should have started in 2020. So it's chair and secretary, vice chair and treasurer. And yeah, maybe if anybody has their bylaws handy, they can double check which variation it is. But Jasmine, is that something you can look into and get back to us in a sec, maybe?
Yes, I can look and I'll post it in the chat for you guys.
Cool, thank you very much. So we'll clarify exactly who's there for how long, because that is good information to know, that rather than just all of us being here randomly for as long as we want. Okay, now moving on. Any other questions? Sure. Okay, we need more coffee out there. Let's see. SLCN's proposal to facilitate Salt Lake City community engagement. Here's the deal. Based on all the feedback that we received in our last meeting, talking with Salt Lake City, recognizing their clear responsibility to engage with community organizations, but also their limitations on how much resources they have available to do that. We are proposing to Salt Lake City that SLCN be the conduit for community engagement from Salt Lake City. So you may ask, what does that mean? Basically, we've also brought in, working with NeighborWorks, have negotiated some time with Jasmine there to help us on the admin side of things. because the mission of SLCN is to empower and enable each individual community organization to enact the change they want to see in their neighborhood, in their community. We feel that SLCN is definitely in a strong place to be able to help everyone equally and to do so without having our own agenda in the mix. So hopefully we can do that. Would allow SLCN to, for example, get any memberships to groups, like I know Richard and I have spoken about joining the, oh, bloody hell, blanking on it, not enough coffee yet.
Utah Nonprofit Association.
That's the one. And under that, because each one of the recognized community organizations in Salt Lake City is also a member of the board for SLCN, each of you guys fall under that umbrella as well. So let's see, I'm seeing in the chat, did Richard have a question?
You covered what I wanted, Dennis.
Okay. So that's the short version. We'll get some really basic monetary support from Salt Lake City, hopefully, to be able to cover our memberships and whatnots. And the goal is to be able to, with the trainings that we'll have available through the new guidebook that Jasmine has worked with Weston quite a bit on, be able to train any existing or incoming board members so that everyone can have a pretty good idea of what's happening and how and why, much like we're about to go into today with Nick Norris, so that we can learn more about planning, zoning, and how we as community organizations can best represent our communities in the face of the city. So, any questions?
Good start.
Well, kind of a general question. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Somebody was talking.
Oh, go ahead, Richard.
Well, just a kind of general question, you know, I'm seeing 20, I guess 25 people on here, and there are significantly more, I think, community councils than this. We really need to encourage those other ones to participate if you're going to put a face to the city as the representative. That would be one issue. The other issue is that I'm sure everybody knows this, Dennis certainly does. You know, we have a West Side Coalition which deals with issues specific to the West Side that aren't normally encountered by the rest of the community or communities. And I don't know, I mean, I could ask my board of directors, but I doubt seriously we're going to give up our interface directly with the city on those issues because they're issues of equity. So what would you say to that, Dennis? I just want to be able to communicate this back to the board.
I am not at all proposing that Salt Lake City represent community organizations. I'm saying that we simply be the conduit for SLC reaching out to community organizations, and I don't mean in lieu of any direct communications with each individual organization. I mean, just that we are only there to help bolster each of your organizations so that you can do your own advocacy for your neighborhood with the city, with anyone and everyone else. I do not want to get into the middle of every community's issue with anyone and everyone. That would be insane. No, I just want to be able to support each individual organization so that you have the infrastructure within your organization to do what is best for your neighborhood.
So is it fair to say this is kind of more to consolidate resources as opposed
Absolutely.
to change how communications work currently within the city? It's more to enable SLCN to provide a broader service.
So that the city can provide very limited services to community organizations, to all of the community organizations, and can provide it equally by, frankly, just putting everyone under the SLCN umbrella. So it allows them to get off on the cheap by only providing it to a single organization, but it still covers all of us so that everyone can participate and join in with each of their own individual organizations. So hub and spoke, nodes, model, whatever you want to call it, but
then the community liaisons like Jamie Stokes, they still remain and they still
oh yeah, it
interact.
doesn't change any of that. Yeah, we are literally just when you guys have questions or concerns or problems, you're running into roadblocks regarding your nonprofit status. I mean, come to us, let us help you. Here's the forms for the IRS. Here's who you need to talk to with the state to get your state charitable solicitation permit so that you're not in trouble when you're asking for donations.
Structural,
What's that?
the structural support that allows us to actually then focus on the community instead of focusing on how to run an organization.
Absolutely. Now, that's not to say that we're going to do everything for you. It's that we are going to give you the tools, the roadmap. Here's all you need to do. Here's all your questions answered. Let us know what else you need. But just to give you the support that you guys need to be able to do what you want to do in your neighborhood. Sorry, what was that last part, Toby?
Leveraged expertise.
There you go. I love it. Synergy.
So my question was on what's the organizational structure of SLCN, and is there a way that we can either work together or help individual groups for fundraising?
Okay, two very big questions. Organizational structure, we have our executive committee, as we just established 5 minutes ago. Beyond that,
no, I mean the tax structure, 501c3, C4.
501c3.
Okay.
So 501c3, we've got all of our proper permits in order and whatnot, licenses and all that jazz. So hope to help all of you guys achieve that as well. And then you asked about fundraising.
Yeah, is there any benefit to fundraise as a group to either raise funds for the group and besides what the city's providing, or for to help certain members of the group raise funds?
There are always benefits to fundraising because goodness, if we've got more funds, we can do stuff. The purpose of this organization is to, for example, on your screen right now, for each one of you, you are seeing a dozen different photos from a dozen different community organizations throughout the city. This is a fantastic chance to be able to network. And much like Richard says with the West Side Coalition, you've got certain issues that affect certain areas that may affect more than one community council, but doesn't necessarily affect the entire city. So this is a fantastic opportunity to bring everybody together and start to talk about, hey, I've got this issue. I know Amy Hawkins is working closely with Glendale and with Central Ninth regarding crime issues in their neighborhoods. That's the sort of thing that isn't necessarily a big problem for Toby, but certainly affects them, and we can hope to facilitate their partnerships, bringing together more people to your table, because this is about your issues in your neighborhood, whatever they may be, so that, and we want to empower you and give you the tools you need to be able to fight those battles. And that means connecting to any possible allies as well in that battle. So, and Richard's done a fantastic job with bringing up the West Side Coalition, so that it's all 6 West Side community councils that do something like this also on a very regular basis, and specifically for that, for all those issues that do overlap. I mean, the inland port affects all of us. So let's see, Toby's very upset with 5G towers. Does anyone else have a problem with Bill Gates knowing where we are at all times? What was that, Toby?
I'm not, my community is. And it's really the placement of the towers. And what they brought up is that it's a design issue. There's too many of them, and they would like to see a pushback to make the manufacturers have to do better at the very least. But I'm not asking, do you want to change this? Or I'm not asking, how do we change this? What I'm asking is this just people in my neighborhood, or are other people hearing that from their neighbors as well? Because if so, I think we need to get those neighbors working together, because there's a lot of passion and energy there that if we can combine them, then maybe they can make an effort to change what they want to change.
It's absolutely not just your neighborhood, Toby. I think a thing that a lot of folks don't realize, but if they did, there would be considerably more uproar is, yeah, what Nigel just said. The idea that these aren't the only 5G towers that are coming in. There's no requirement for companies to share infrastructure. And so this could be the first of 5 sets of 5G towers we get, or any other kinds of exciting, disgusting looking infrastructure in the public right of way, right? And if you're a neighborhood that's still trying to get other things in the public right of way for the public good, for example, a private lighting program, having more junk piled in
Hold
the
on, Amy.
public right of way prevents it. Sorry.
I apologize for cutting you off, but I don't want this to devolve into a discussion on 5G towers or utilities in general.
But what they're
But-
proposing is to start a class action suit amongst citizens of Salt Lake to go directly. So
Toby, hang on.
if I put that together and pass that out, would you guys share that with your neighborhood councils as well, so I can have done my part?
Happy to.
Fantastic.
Thank
So
you.
anyone here can certainly reach out to Toby. If they don't know how to contact them, reach out to us. We can make that connection. And if Toby wants to share it with us too, then we can share it with all of you. Fabulous. There we go. That's what we're here for. Great. Okay, then that's the case. We'll move forward with that and get on to the meat of our meeting here and learn how can we best represent our communities in front of the Planning Commission, the Planning Department. Nick, teach us everything that has to do with ugly buildings and non-affordable housing.
Right. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about this, because I think it's an important discussion. I do kind of want to preface it with, it's also going to be a pretty challenging discussion, I think, to hear. And I say that because of how land use decisions are crafted under state law and the limitations that we have once we establish land use rules. So as I understand what was asked of me was to come and discuss that and where the best opportunities are to engage the planning division, the planning commission, and ultimately the city council on land use and development. And so I wanted to start with state law, and there's a couple of I didn't have a presentation. I wanted this to mainly be a discussion and Q&A type of thing, and I can take as long as you guys want or have time for. And frankly, I don't know that we can cover it all, but there's a couple of things in state code that really limit what cities can do once they establish, like I said, the zoning rules. So in state code, they're called land use regulations. And the premise is that the most important and influential time to engage the city on land use matters is during the adoption of master plans and the zoning rules. That's where the city has the absolute most flexibility in what they can do. Because once those rules are adopted under state law, we are obligated to, and land use applicants get the benefit of approval. And so the state law that I was going to talk about first, it's for those that find any kind of interest in reading state code, which is really hard to do, but if you can't sleep at night, it might help that. So state code 10-9A is commonly referred to as, in planning circles, as LUDMA. It's the Land Use Development and Management Act. This is where that cities get their authority to zone and create master plans and subdivide land and deals with appeals of land use decisions and all of that fun stuff. But what this chapter says is that, and I'm just going to read this so you guys can hear it. This is in 10-9A 509, and this is dealing with the land use applicant. So basically what it says is that an applicant is entitled to approval of a land use application if the application conforms to the requirements of the land use regulations, land use decisions, and development standards once their application is complete. There are two exceptions when someone is not entitled. One is if the proposal creates, and this is very legal and I apologize for it, but if the proposal creates a compelling countervailing public interest, or we are in the process of adopting codes that would otherwise make that application prohibited. So what that means is the countervailing public interest is a really difficult standard. It basically means that if a proposal is somehow going to be damaging to the public as a whole or to a specific property owner, then the land use authorities, which in most cases are the Planning Commission in Salt Lake City, but can say no, provided they can do it in writing. And there has to be very, very specific findings to do that. It's very rare in Utah that it actually happens. Most of them are challenged in court, and most of the time the cities lose when they find that. There have been some exceptions. One example that I'll give you of what that means is that there was a development proposal that was outside of Salt Lake City that would have impacted somebody's access to their property. And the city denied that, I think it was a conditional use, denied that conditional use, and the applicant appealed that to court, and the applicant won. And the reason the applicant won is because the city could have conditioned that approval to address the access issue. So the point being is that if there is a way that that the city can mitigate or reduce an impact like that, we're going to have to take that and approve a project. And so that makes it really hard once we get land use applications to influence the outcome and the change. And that's why the zoning regulations themselves are so important, because once those are established, it establishes property rights. And we're a country that is based on property rights. You know, that's embedded in our Constitution in multiple places. And so, you know, we have to kind of honor that. And when we talk about property rights, we're talking about the right to use your property as determined by law. And so that gets at that crux of it. So we have a number of applications that go to the community councils by ordinance. So conditional uses, design review, plan developments, sometimes special exceptions. Those are kind of the key things that go to the Planning Commission. And each of those carries a different level of discretion. So with a conditional use, if something meets the standards and there's no reasonably anticipated, what the state law says, detrimental impact, we have to approve it. We also have to approve it if those impacts can be reasonably reduced. And what that means is just even a minimum amount. It doesn't have to be eliminated. It has to be reduced. So when we're talking about a conditional use, we really are looking at how that proposal, what impacts it creates, and how those can be addressed. So common impacts are things, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, but are things like let's say somebody's coming in and they're building a restaurant and they put their dumpster right on the property line with a residential use. It's reasonably anticipated that that dumpster is going to cause a nuisance for that next door neighbor. And so we can put conditions on where it goes and how it's concealed and making sure it's covered and things like that. And so the comments that we get from the neighbors and the community really have to be focused to be useful on those impacts. things like that are pretty subjective, we can't use. In fact, there was the state legislature just passed a bill that added one word to the conditional use standards. Says they have to be objective. So those subjective types of things, like an example that we hear a lot is very broad, that the proposal is going to ruin our neighborhood or destroy our community or destroy the character of the neighborhood. And those things are pretty subjective. And so we can't really use those without being more specific about what that means. And so the directed comments are much more helpful, because then we can decide if there is a reasonably anticipated impact and what to do about it. One way to think about it is that a conditional use is not a discretionary review, meaning if it meets standards, it's approved, and we have to honor that and follow it. And the design review is very much the same. It's often confusing, partly because of how the code's written, which doesn't help. But design review is triggered essentially due to the scale of a building. And the idea behind it is that buildings of different scale or larger scale than what's commonly found in an area might create some impact that is different than the typical building. So you may see in some zoning districts where you can raise the height from 60 feet to 90 feet if you go through the design review. And the design review process is intended to address those potential impacts from the change in the building scale that's allowed by code. So again, if something meets those standards, those objective standards, then it ends up having to be approved by the Planning Commission. And so again, we're looking for those impacts that are created by that.
Nick, could I interrupt with a question?
Absolutely, please.
Thanks.
Do.
And as you're well aware, we're super interested in getting a version like this in front of the general public in Ballpark and Central Ninth as soon as possible, because folks really don't understand exactly what you're saying now. Like, what are reasonable objections that they can make that planning will listen to when something's going through the design review process? There is no widespread understanding of that whatsoever. Could you give, I thought your dumpster example was super understandable. Could you give a similar example for design review and, for example, height or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And probably the easiest example that I think is tangible to people is in our downtown, where buildings over a certain height have to go through the design review. And there's lots of reasons for that. The primary reasons are for the impact it has on public spaces, the sidewalk, downtown, like next to Gallivan, and alleys and streets and things like that. And that could be anything from how a building, how much sunshine the building blocks. So in the winter, making sure that there's a reasonable chance that the sun will melt the ice, which in the summer we want it to shade the sidewalk so it's more comfortable. But also to do things like making sure that when ice builds up on glass surfaces on upper elevations, that ice doesn't fall on the sidewalk and jeopardize the safety of pedestrians. And so those are the kinds of things that we would be looking at. There are some design review things that are modifications to what's called the design standard. And so, for example, some zoning districts have a minimum distance between doors to a building. The idea being that if you're going to have a big wide building along the sidewalk, that we want it to be engaging and activate the sidewalk with multiple doors, multiple storefronts and things like that, instead of big, long, 300-foot wide of essentially nothing that people can't access and tell what's going on inside the building. And so the process also includes modifications to those types of things that are allowed. So some of those can be approved at the staff level. Some of them have to go to the Planning Commission. The staff level approvals are very minor. Like, for example, that building length of a building wall can only be modified up to 10% by staff. If it's bigger than that, it has to go to the Planning Commission. And the idea behind it is that we don't know what's going to happen in neighborhoods because we're not in neighborhoods every day. But those people who live next to projects are, or who work next to projects or own their businesses next to projects are in those neighborhoods, and they understand how the place functions better than we do. And so that input really is valuable in that regard on those things. Does that help?
The question, it's a little more, it's a little chewier. This is Richard Holman with the West Side Coalition.
Hi, Richard.
Good to see you again. And I'm glad to see my friend David Shear and Dorothy Owen on the call because, you know, we're very concerned about the potential for a rail terminal being placed on Sitla property. And one of the things that we notice on a continuing basis is that every project's evaluated on its own merit, but we don't take into account the collective impact of many projects going on at one time, as in the Utah Inland Port. A rail terminal or a transmodal facility built adjacent to our neighborhoods has a tremendous impact on 6 neighborhoods from an air quality perspective, supersizing the port, meaning that we have more truck traffic coming in because we have a much larger facility. I am just really confused as to how the zoning of that area protects our neighborhoods from yet another rail yard, yet increasing traffic, increasing congestion. It's a little bit chewier and a lot more complex of an issue than just a dumpster on a property line.
Yeah,
Yep.
if I could, this is David Shear. If I could just jump in to add to Richard's point. As you know, Nick, a rail terminal is a conditional use in M1. And there's a footnote to that says that any rail yard within 5 miles of an existing rail yard is prohibited. We consider that to be an important provision in the zoning code to protect the neighborhood Richard's talking about against the effects of another rail yard. Do you think that the language of those provisions in the ordinance will be sufficient to allow the city to deny approval of a rail yard?
So, well, first, that 5 mile provision was changed a couple of years ago. I don't remember what specifically we changed it to, but it was reduced. And I think it was put more towards the distance from residential zoning districts, but I can't remember all of those details. But the idea behind that was to add, and in that overlay that applies north of I-80 out there, that includes different, more stringent conditional use standards. So there's more requirements for air quality and things like that they'd have to address and prove that their impact is that the impact can be mitigated, basically. And so to be frank with you, the conditional use process in general is pretty limited. And I think that we know that as a city, but frankly, it's the only tool that we really have outside of prohibiting uses. And so, and I think, you know, you're right, it's a much chewier and meatier discussion about how we got to where we are out there, and probably could take hours to discuss. And
well, we need your help in we need your help or your staff's help in sorting that out so we know exactly what's going to happen or what could potentially happen. The Utah Inland Port Board is meeting soon. They have a lot of things on their agenda for land use, purchases, allocation of resources for upgrades. And our concern has been and remains that the Sitla property will be capped and will then result in a transmodal facility being placed on that property. That's adjacent to several neighborhoods. But I think the chewier part is the air quality impacts that result from that affect the entire city.
Yep. No, I don't disagree with that. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing as a city, is that, you know, our ability to influence that really is limited. And we knew several years ago when that whole inland port thing was going through the state legislature for the first time, what the likely outcome was going to be. And frankly, I think the city's hands we were kind of backed into a corner for sure on that. But
So-
as that comes to more fruition, then clearly if we end up getting involved as a city with any sort of conditional use, then that particular code, we do require an environmental impact statement to be submitted as part of that, and we would actually route that out for independent review versus relying on city planners who may not have a background in that particular degree of science to make a determination. So
I appreciate that.
That's a question. What are the tools that the private developers use that private citizens could potentially employ to basically do the same thing to halt the development then? Should it be a class action suit? How should private citizens then take this into their own hands if the city's unable to?
Oh boy, that's probably more of a legal question for an attorney to answer, but the reality is that once regulations are in place and someone's proposing a development utilizing those processes and regulations that are adopted, there's going to be very little you can do to stop something.
But if I were Rio Tinto, what would I come in with? Like, what would I come to the table with to ensure that I win?
Well, I guess it depends, right? Like Rio Tinto does a lot of different things, and they're they don't have a lot of development in Salt Lake City, but so it's hard for me to say if somebody came in, let's just say, a similar extractive industry like on Beck Street. If they came in with some sort of a proposal that to further extract gravel or whatever they're pulling out, the first thing that happens is that there are certain state regulations that they'd have to comply with, and they have to actually get approval from the state authorities, basically Department of Environmental Quality, and then there's also a division. I don't know if they're in a different department, but that deals with extractive industries and mining operations, and then once they're okay, then they go through the land use approval with the city. And we can't do anything. The other piece about state code is that
that mainly a bunch of lawyers? Is that lobbyists? What are the tools they're using to influence those decision makers or to interact with those decision makers?
So I don't know what tools they use at the state level. I'm assuming that they hire all kinds of consultant teams that use lawyers, geotechnical experts, mining experts, things like that to address air quality experts. The gravel pits do create quite a bit of air quality issues, but that is a state level issue, and once they go through those permitting processes, then we are handed what they already are required to do, and we can't do anything that's contrary to what the state agencies do or contrary to a state provision regulating those types of uses. Not all land uses have that state overarching permitting process, but some of them do, and we're stuck with that. But moving on to some of the other processes, the one process where the Planning Commission has quite a bit of discretion are with plan developments. And the reason that they have discretion on those types of applications versus others is because the applicant is asking to modify some sort of standard. And they're not losing property rights if it were to be denied. They can still develop, they just have to develop and meet the code. And so the purpose of the plan development is to create some flexibility, particularly for infill development, which is, that's almost all what we see in Salt Lake City with the exception of some of the industrial areas. But most of what we see is considered infill development, meaning it's property that's already been developed at some point in the past and it's just changing. Or it's a remnant lot that has never been developed, but it's surrounded by other development. So that's where the planning commission has more discretion. There are two exceptions to that because we have two zoning districts that require all new development to go through the plan development process. So that's in the area around Gateway. So it's called the GMU zone. And then in the community shopping zoning district, which is really small. There's only a few parcels in the city that are zoned that. So Trolley Square, some of you may recall back to the Foothill Village, things like that. Some of you may recall back to the discussion several years ago about the Walmart on Parley's Way, where they were proposing to rezone it to the CS zone, and it's zoned for more CB, which is similar to what 9th is zoned for, and that ultimately failed. But that's two examples of where that is. We are actually going to propose, hopefully in the next few years, if not sooner, to take those out of the plan development process and shift them into design review so that we're avoiding any sort of denial of a plan development and opening the door to what's called a regulatory taking, which could happen if we're denying all reasonable use of property. And if we require development to go through a process, then we're getting our toes wet a little bit in some potential legal issues. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. I think one is if we can talk about the master plan process. So here, the question is what happens when the master plan conflicts with zoning. Master plans are guides. They don't establish development rights. The zoning does. And so if the zoning allows something, it is always going to trump the master plan. That's why it's important, and we're it's important that zoning aligns with our master plans. Most cities, and Salt Lake City is not unique to this, don't go through and do wholesale zoning changes when they adopt a general plan or community plan or something like that. They typically wait for property owners, developers, et cetera, to submit those applications. We actually don't think that that's the best way to plan and develop your city. And so we would hope that we get more resources so that when we are adopting updates to our community plans, that we can also update the zoning at the same time so it reflects that. And that, I think, also helps change that discussion with community about what's important and what outcomes are, instead of essentially pushing it down the line to when a developer comes in to propose something and they need a zoning change to build their project, which starts to create some contention and sometimes rightfully so. So that's kind of a discussion about the master plans. Really are our guide, and we typically will support most proposals that comply with the city's goals and policies recognized in the plans. That's why that is such an important piece to get community input in, because that we kind of consider that those are charter, right? That's what we are trying to do and why we're trying to accomplish things as a planning division. In zoning is the primary tool that implements those plans, and so it's important that it aligns. It's important that the community has a say in what those zoning regulations are, so that we can ensure that those issues are identified and applied evenly across the zone instead of piece by piece and project by project, which makes it a little bit harder and more challenging and more contentious. Are there any other, there's another question in here about, I guess more specifically with ADUs. We don't know how many have been constructed without application or approval process. That's something that we discover typically when somebody comes in and tries to get some other permit for something, or they suddenly are advertising that unit for rent, and suddenly we get an idea about that if we have the resources to look at it and to review those things. But the enforcement piece of the city is actually done in a different work group than the planning division. So we help advise them on what zoning means, but civil enforcement is outside of the planning division. And so we're not the group that does that enforcement, but we work with them pretty frequently. So with the zoning rules and that process, the other reason why it's really important that the engagement happens at that level is that this goes back to state law, is that when we are interpreting what a code means, the state code basically says that unless we are prohibiting a land use application, we have to interpret our code to favor the land use application. So if there's any sort of vagueness or a standard can be reasonably interpreted to mean different things, we have to interpret it to favor the land use applicant and the property right. We can't favor it to in terms of the general what neighbors feel it should mean, or what we think it should mean. We have to look at it through the lens of what it means for that property right, that development right, which oftentimes creates some contention with the community, and some of the reasons why we have conflicts. And we hear a lot that people feel like we're not listening to the community, and sometimes there's some absolute justification for that, and we try to do our best to address that. But oftentimes it's because we have to follow what the state code says, and we can't. One thing that we could do a better job at as a city is being more forthright with that, and telling people, yeah, we hear you. Unfortunately, because of this, and this, we can't take that into consideration at the project level, but we can as the city is considering changes to zoning rules. Are there, let's see, I don't know if you guys just want me to switch to answering questions. In interest of time, that's probably where we are. So yeah, there's a question here about the new state ADU rule that will impact our ADU ordinance and our regulations. But basically what it means is that if an ADU is internal to a home, basement is an addition or something like that, we have to permit it. And so it's going to be considered, we're going to have to change it once that law goes into effect. And unlike most state laws, the effective date is 6 months from now. And so we will probably try to update our ADU rules within that time frame to follow state code. But even if we don't, we still have to follow state code. And so that will be something that we'll address. There's also some limitations on what cities can regulate in terms of ADUs when they're internal. And so we'll have to figure that out as we get into that process a little bit.
Nick, I had a question about that. I read through the report, and one of the things that it discussed was the cost of an ADU. With the passage of HB 82, will that reduce the costs and permitting process for internal ADUs in Salt Lake?
It does, because it eliminates that conditional use fee. That's a pretty small fee, and that the fee itself probably isn't a detriment to people wanting to build ADUs. There's many other fees that are far greater and substantial, and the code doesn't really address those things. So I don't know how much it's gonna change that.
Well, it did. HB 82 created a fund that would help with those fees. Didn't eliminate the fees, but it allowed a homeowner to borrow on a real favorable terms in certain conditions.
Right. Yeah, it did, and it was a small. I can't remember the amount, but yeah, there are some funds available to help owners actually get these things off the ground.
Okay, thank you.
One more, Nick, for you. It's been my experience so far that much that goes on in the legislature is geared towards protection of the public in terms of what we build and where we build it and the consequences of building it. What does the city do to weigh in on these issues that have disparate impact on communities, and they see a bill come across the legislature that it's clear it's going to have an impact. Is there a way that you sort of weigh in on that and get your thoughts to the table with the legislator?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things that we do. So we participate in a group with other cities and the development community through the Utah League of Cities and Towns, that when the legislature is not in session, we discuss issues and potential bills, and we try to work out some solutions that protect cities' abilities to address exactly what you're bringing up, but also protect the property rights for the development community. And so we do that. We also, the city has a legislative team that's made up of representatives from the mayor's office, city council office, and the attorney's office, and we employ lobbyists. And every single division and department in the city has somebody who engages with that legislative team during the legislative session to review bills, to make recommendations on changes and what the city's position should be. And we have a big internal network that does that. And frankly, that for the first kind of 2 to 3 weeks before the legislative session starts through the full session, that is priority number one for those people who are on their team, including me. So that is basically all I've done for the past, 2.5 months, is legislative issues, and read those bills, understand how they impact the city, what the detriments are, and sometimes what the favorable pieces are. There are some things that are favorable that come out of that as well.
Thanks, Nick. We appreciate your time. We would like to have you back again, maybe in a couple of months, to carry forward the discussion. We want to thank everyone for coming and supporting the communities as a whole, the Salt Lake City community. Wanted to let you know, Richard, the East Bench has a coalition. East Bench Coalition is called the East Bench Master Planning Group, and all 7 community councils meet once a month, the last Monday of the month, and we focus on issues that are East Bench specific. Right now, we're hyper focused on Foothill Boulevard and improving that. Any goodbyes, questions, statements, leaving proverbs?
And I will add that, and many of you, I've been to many of the community councils to give kind of a zoning 101. It's not as legally focused as this has been, but we're absolutely happy to provide that kind of information to anybody who wants to request it. We try to work it in the best we can. I try to do it personally because, one, I enjoy doing it, but I also think that it helps the community to know that we have people that are at the decision-making level, helping the community understand what our roles are and how they can best interact with us. So thank you for the time.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Take care. Wear a mask.